But good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see again wonderful familiar faces that have been with us during this program year. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Betty Tonzi, and I'm on the board of the Indiana Council of World Affairs. And I'm joined by other board members who have really looked forward to presenting this evening's program. We're very excited about it. Just a reminder that this is the last program for distinguished speakers for the 2022-2023 program year. And then we still have one more program left for the entire two-series program. The last one will be for Great Decisions, and that will be in 2 weeks. That will be on war sanctions. How effectively do they work? And our speaker that evening will be Dr. George Lopez from the University of Notre Dame, who right now is just finishing up his commitment with the United Nations Security Council as he's worked out just this very issue with them, with a host of other people from around the country. But this evening's program we're very excited about. When we plan our programs out many months in advance, because we have to kind of make sure there's no timely, that we can't plan too far in advance, but we want to make sure the programs are urgent, that are timely, are meeting an issue that people want to know about. And with that, Dr. Atlas, who will be introducing our speaker this evening, and who actually found our speaker, he said, I'd like to do a program in April on the Good Friday Accord, the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Accord. And it's very serendipitous that he had the thought again months ago. But our own president was just recently over there for the celebration of that, but also to discuss about what is going on currently as we cover this evening. And I think many of us who are of the age that we well remember the tensions associated with that very long conflict. It was violent, it was bloody, it left very deep scars and memories in Ireland, but people who are above all else Irish. And we're going to hear a lot about that this evening. For right now, I would like to introduce Dr. Atlas. He is our fellow board member as well. Dr. Atlas is a senior lecturer with the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and he is also a faculty affiliate with the Center for the Study of Middle East, with Indiana University in Bloomington. Dr. Pierre will be having a discussion with our speaker, and then the usual format, inviting your questions. So, Dr. Atlas.
Good evening. Thank you, Betty. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for joining us. Just to go over the format real quick before I introduce our speaker. So I will introduce Consul General Byrne. He will give a presentation on the background and all of that. And then after that, the Consul General and I will have a conversation. I'll ask some questions. We'll talk for a few minutes. And then the third part and final part of the program will be, we will be taking your questions. And so you will have the opportunity to type them in the chat, and then also to ask them yourself and engage in your questions with the Consul General. So it is my pleasure, my honor to introduce Consul General Byrne, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. Kevin Byrne was Consul General to the Midwest United States in September 2020. He joined the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in 2010 and has served in the European Union Division, Corporate Services, and in Ireland's consulate in San Francisco. He also worked in the Department of the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, where he planned Ireland's successful 2013 presidency of the European Union. Prior to taking up his post in Chicago, Kevin was secretary to the management board of the department and policy liaison with the Office of the President of Ireland. Before joining the Foreign Service, Kevin worked in European institutions in Brussels, the think tank sector in London, and taught in France and Japan. He is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, a beautiful campus that I visited this summer, the London School of Economics, and is a Naughton Scholar. Kevin is married to his husband, Aristotle. Again, it's my pleasure to pass the microphone, so to speak, over to Consul General Byrne. Sir, the floor is yours.
Dr. Atlas Pierre, thank you so much for that introduction. And Betty, thank you for setting the stage on what is a very important year for Northern Ireland, a very important year for Ireland. I just want to thank Board President Ray Montagno and the whole board of the Indiana Council on World Affairs It's a real privilege to speak to you and your members today. I'm going to share some slides, so you'll be able to follow where I'm going with my presentation. I used to be a teacher, and I always think context is really, really important in any topic or any discussion. So what I'm going to talk about is, let me just pull up my screen here. So I'm going to, I suppose, look at the issue chronologically. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the Troubles. So in typical Irish understatement, the very brutal, very bloody conflict that took place in Northern Ireland for over 30 years was called the Troubles. So I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the Troubles. I'll talk about the Troubles themselves, what they looked like, their impact on Northern Ireland as a society, on British-Irish relations, and on Ireland more generally. Then I'll talk about the peace process, which led up eventually to the Good Friday Agreement. I'll talk about the agreement itself, some of its provisions, and then I'll talk about successes, some of the challenges that remain, and then talk about some of the key takeaways before I take your questions. While I talk about, I suppose, the origins of the Troubles and the Troubles themselves, there's quite a bit of history in that and quite a lot of terminology. So I'm going to open it up for questions just after those two pieces, just to make sure everybody is fully up to speed on the actors, on some of the history that led up to it, and then from that we can move forward and look at the more recent history and the agreement itself. As I mentioned, and as Betty mentioned in her introduction, we're celebrating this year and this month indeed a quarter century of peace in Northern Ireland. It is a peace that was incredibly hard won. It is a peace that was brought about by the Good Friday Agreement. You might also have heard the term the Belfast Agreement. So the Good Friday Agreement and the Belfast Agreement are used interchangeably. It being Northern Ireland, there are two communities, is how you can generally view Northern Ireland as being composed of. One of the communities calls it the Belfast Agreement generally, one of them calls it the Good Friday Agreement. We don't need to go into who does what, but just know that both can be used interchangeably. And one of the things I really want to focus on in my talk and try and draw out, and hopefully we'll get to maybe speak about it a little bit more in the questions, is that while the agreement belongs first and foremost to the people of Northern Ireland, in many ways it was an agreement that was made in America and could not have been achieved or indeed sustained over the last quarter century without the engagement and the support of the US, both in the White House, on Capitol Hill, and right throughout the States. So that's something that I think is really, really important. Another piece that I think is important to note is that the Good Friday Agreement, I think, is one of the great successes of US foreign policy of the last half century. It really is an example of what can be achieved with determination, imagination, compromise, perseverance, and most importantly, patience. This is an agreement that took a very, very long time. And still today, it's an agreement that we work on daily to ensure that the peace is maintained and the full benefits of peace can both be realized and enjoyed by the people of Northern Ireland. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the terms that you've probably heard used in relation to Northern Ireland, or the Good Friday Agreement, or the Troubles. I suppose first and foremost, it's what the place is called. So often you can hear the North, Northern Ireland, the 6 counties, Ulster. Those terms are all used more or less interchangeably for the same region, which is, I suppose, the upper northeast 6 counties of the island of Ireland. Those 6 counties are part of the United Kingdom, which of course is composed of the island of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So the 4 nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, make up the United Kingdom. And then you'll hear Ireland, the Republic, the South, sometimes the 26 counties. Those all refer to the state known as Ireland, which are also the Republic of Ireland, which is the southern 26 counties of the island of Ireland, and that is the state that I represent with pride. Then you often hear about, I suppose, the communities, sometimes called the traditions, within Northern Ireland, and generally throughout most of Northern Ireland's history, or the history of that region of Ireland, there have been two communities. There's been what's sometimes simplified as the Catholic community and the Protestant community. So while the two identifiers, I suppose, for the different communities are religious identifiers, the conflict itself isn't about the contents of either faith. It's really about, I suppose, the history and the aspirations and the national identity, you could say, of those communities. So often in the literature, you might see CNR, which stands for Catholic Nationalist Republican. So generally, those terms are used broadly interchangeably for the community in Northern Ireland that sees themselves as Irish and that generally would have an aspiration to become part of a 32 county united Ireland, that they would seek to join the Republic. And then the other tradition, or the other community, is sometimes in the academic literature simplified as PUL, which is Protestant, Unionist, and Loyalist. So essentially, these people see their future as being remaining in union with Britain. So for them, that link and that connection to Britain, to the Crown, to British history is something that is central and core to their identity. So I suppose these are the two antagonistic communities that we will be looking at when we look at the history, and I suppose now the two communities that are working together to build a peaceful, prosperous Northern Ireland. So again, just to come back on that final point, so while we often say Catholic or Protestant, again, these only denote membership of a broader political group, and it's not indeed actually a conflict about religious doctrine. Just to jump back to very, very quickly give 300 or more years of history in about 30 seconds. So really the political divisions within Northern Ireland stem from what was called plantations. So plantations were essentially where the British monarch planted or moved often the younger sons of nobles and gave them land in Northern Ireland because there was no land for them in the UK. This happened right throughout Ireland, but particularly so in Ulster around the 1600s. So it was what was called the Plantation of Ulster, where a large number of English and particularly Scottish settlers were given land in Ulster. These tended to be Protestant, and that, I suppose, is where you see that Protestant community taking root and building homes on the island of Ireland. In many ways, this political division was consolidated geographically with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which was signed in 1921 between Ireland and Britain. This divided the island of Ireland into two separate entities: Northern Ireland, which remained in the United Kingdom, and then Ireland, the 26 counties of the south. So really, I suppose that political division became solidified with the formation of Northern Ireland as a separate political entity, a separate political statelet within the United Kingdom. Then if we look at more recent history, so 1921 to the late 1960s, Northern Ireland had its own devolved government, and this devolved government was separate from the British Parliament in Westminster. So there were elements of policy that were overseen by that Northern Ireland administration. However, in the formation of Northern Ireland in the early 1920s, it was assured that in those 6 counties there was a Unionist or a Protestant majority. So that meant that Catholics that lived in Northern Ireland were in the minority, and Northern Ireland in many ways was designed to ensure that that was the case. There are reasons for that, which I won't go into. Possibly we can touch on those in questions at the end, but I want to not get too bogged down in the history so we can talk more about the agreement itself. But needless to say, in that government, which was overseen by the Unionist majority, nationalists or Catholics suffered discrimination, both politically through gerrymandered political districts and electoral districts, and systematic discrimination. So systematic discrimination in the jobs market, in public housing, and in a whole other suite of other areas of society. Of particular importance is to note that the Royal Ulster Constabulary, so the police force in Northern Ireland, was very heavily staffed by the Protestant community. So you had a majority community policing a state which had a significant minority that had very little stake in policing itself, which of course, not just in Northern Ireland but elsewhere, is a recipe for unrest and difficulty. Then we jump to the late 1960s. So inspired by the civil rights movement in the US, and I suppose this is one of those pieces where the US experience had a very deep impact on Ireland and on Northern Ireland. So inspired by civil rights in the US, there was a nascent civil rights movement in Northern Ireland called NICRA, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, and they protested. They stood up for rights of the minority, for the Catholic nationalist community. But however, in 1969, as a result of heavy-handed policing of peaceful civil rights campaigners, it led to a large degree of civil unrest, which eventually fed through in certain quarters to a revival of paramilitary organizations, both on the nationalist, the Republican, the Catholic side, and then also on the Protestant Unionist and Loyalist side. And I suppose that really set up the Troubles themselves. So just in terms of what the Troubles, I actually might just, given we've gone through quite a lot of history in quite a short period of time, if there are any questions just around that historical piece that I need to speak about a little bit more or clarify, if there are any questions, I might just take them now, because I suppose the rest of the slides and the rest of the presentation is predicated on an understanding of that, I suppose, the antecedents to the Troubles. So I might just pause for a moment to see if there are any questions. I'll take a sip of my strategically positioned cup of tea, which is what every Irish diplomat needs while they're speaking. If no questions, I didn't see any pop up there. We'll talk now about the Troubles. So just to give a little bit of context for the Troubles. So many of you will remember, reading about the Troubles or seeing them on television. Just to give some context on Northern Ireland itself. So Northern Ireland is particularly small. It is a small geographic area. So Northern Ireland, the full area of Northern Ireland, would sit inside Indiana 6.5 times. So we're really talking about a very, very small area. Population now is about 1.5 million. At the start of the Troubles, it was a couple 100,000 less, but a small population, again, many, many times smaller than Indiana. So really, when we talk about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, we're talking about both a very small area geographically and quite a small population of people. And I think that's important to note just when we start to talk about the impact on the number of deaths, the number of those injured in the Troubles over the 30 years of the Troubles. There's a line from Yeats, many of you might know it, great hatred, little room maimed us from the start. And this really was one of the issues in Northern Ireland, very, very strongly held opinions and perspectives, and very little space within which people lived. So in terms of the impact of the Troubles themselves, they raged for about 30 years, from the end of the 1960s, early 1970s until about 1998. 3,600 people were killed over those 30 years, and 47,000 were injured. So really, we're looking at a very large minority of people within the community at that time. Just in terms of grossing that up to America, to bring it to the American level, if Northern Ireland were the same size as America and had the same population as America, we're talking about over 30 years, 800,000 people being killed in the conflict and 11 million people being injured in the conflict. So really, we're talking about a hugely impactful conflict and wave of violence that really impacted so deeply the residents and the citizens of Northern Ireland. In terms of who was injured, just over half were civilians, about 32%, 30%, a third, were members of the British security forces, and about 15 to 16% were members of paramilitary groups on both sides, both Republican or Loyalist. Republican paramilitaries were responsible for about 60% of the deaths, Loyalists about 30% of the deaths, and then security forces about 10% of the deaths. It really was a conflict that impacted right across society. Just under 1,500 of the deaths were those under the age of 25, and just under 10% of the deaths were kids, were those under the age of 18, and 70% of those injured were civilians. So really, this was a conflict that touched everybody and touched everybody quite deeply. It's interesting if you look at the impact of the Troubles, not just on Northern Ireland, but on Ireland as a whole. I was at a talk just over the weekend with the ambassador who grew up in Drogheda, so just County Louth, which is a border county of Northern Ireland. And she speaks about being a schoolgirl during the Troubles, and she remembers there essentially being refugees from Northern Ireland that joined her school and her classes during this time, because Northern Ireland was not a safe place for families, and people left and moved to border counties or elsewhere in the south in the Republic to pursue their lives with safety. So really, it was a very, very impactful and very damaging conflict. I suppose I can speak maybe a little bit about my own experiences. I grew up in Dundalk, which is about 10 miles from the border with Northern Ireland. I'm 40 this year, so I was a kid right throughout the Troubles. My family comes from Northern Ireland, just over the border, although I grew up myself in the south. And just in my day-to-day life, I would have seen the impacts of the Troubles. We used to travel north to go shopping as kids, or when we had friends over, we'd go north to a place called Newry to go shopping, and we had to cross the border between the north and the south. And I was telling Pierre in a conversation we had earlier on that the border was a heavily militarized border. I've traveled quite a bit around the world, and the only border I can compare it to is the border between Israel and Palestine. It was at such a level of militarization. It was really quite oppressive and really quite stark when you had to cross the border. Today that's gone. There is no border you can drive between north and south without any impediment, and we can speak maybe a little bit about that when we're talking about the successes of the Good Friday Agreement. Then next, I suppose we'll talk about the peace process itself, a little bit of the timeline and steps towards peace. There were a number of attempts by both the British and the Irish government to secure a peace in Northern Ireland and to end the cycles of violence. One of the first was called the Sunningdale Agreement. It was in the early 1970s, 1973, 1974. It ultimately didn't take root because the unionist community, and particularly the unionist working class community, went out on strike until the agreement fell. But essentially what it did is it looked at an early version of power sharing between the Catholic community and the Protestant community in a devolved government. And it also had what was called an Irish dimension. So essentially it gave the government in the south input into elements of governance in Northern Ireland. The next, I suppose, really impactful and important agreement, I suppose, on the road to the Good Friday Agreement was called the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So this was agreed in 1985 between the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, Garret Fitzgerald, and the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And this treaty gave the Irish government what was known as an advisory role in Northern Ireland's government. And again, this is coming back to what was agreed in Sunningdale, that Irish dimension. It also confirmed that there would be no change in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland unless the majority of its citizens agreed to it. So essentially, Northern Ireland would never become part of the Republic unless a majority of the citizens within Northern Ireland agreed that this is something that they wanted, and this was called the principle of consent. Both this Irish dimension and principle of consent and power sharing form key parts of what became the Good Friday Agreement. And you can see even 13 years before the Good Friday Agreement was signed, that these principles had already been teased out. Next really, really important one was 1993. It was called the Downing Street Declaration. The declaration affirmed both the right of people of Ireland to self-determination, and that Northern Ireland would be transferred to the Republic from the UK only if a majority of the population was in favour of such a move. So again, an underlining of the importance of the principle of consent. So it really established principles of self-determination. And all of these agreements, Sunningdale, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and the Downing Street Declaration were important precursors to the holding of multi-party talks, which ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement. I just want to talk a little bit now about some of the key parties and some of that broader international context, what was really, really important, what were really important as foundations to both the peace process and then ultimately the Good Friday Agreement. I suppose the first was the importance of buy-in from both the British and the Irish governments. This sense from both governments that the conflict in Northern Ireland was not something that could continue. It was something that needed to be stopped, and that both the British and Irish governments felt that they had a role in bringing that about. The second was the importance of the EU context. So the EU was so both Britain and Ireland joined the EU at the same time in 1973. We walked in the door on the same day, and that was really incredibly important, particularly for Ireland, for two reasons. One, both Britain and Ireland had a common context. We worked in a common trade area. The European Union is based on four freedoms: freedom of movement of people, capital, goods, and services. So this just meant that the idea of a border became less important because there was free movement within that European area. I suppose the second really, really important reason for the importance of the EU was that for the first time, Ireland sat at a table in parity with Britain, and we discussed issues that weren't focused on Northern Ireland or just the British-Irish relationship, which obviously had a huge imbalance given the size and power of Britain and the size and power of Ireland. But we talked about common European challenges. So, challenges of security, environment, trade, business, health. So we talked about issues beyond just our own problems. And that was something that was very, very important. And as well, the way the European Union works is politicians and officials from all EU member states. It wasn't the EU then, there were precursors, the EEC, the European Economic Council, and the European Communities. But the important factor is that Irish, British, and other European politicians and officials would work together frequently and see each other quite frequently. So trust could be built up and strengthened, which was very, very important as a backdrop to the peace process. The third was the importance of the US. As I said at the very start, the Good Friday Agreement was, it's owned by the people of Northern Ireland, but it's very much in America. We can go right as far back as 1977 when President Carter drew international attention to the troubles in Northern Ireland. Then President Ronald Reagan and Speaker Tip O'Neill exemplified the really strong bipartisan support that really has become a hallmark of US engagement in Northern Ireland and in the Northern Ireland peace process. Then Bill Clinton and of course Senator George Mitchell, who was the chairman of the talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement, were really pivotal to the conclusion of the agreement itself. And that support of the US has continued right through the last 25 years. We've seen it in really stark relief with the support of Richie Neal, Nancy Pelosi, leaders on Congress, and of course in the White House, to post-Brexit, when one of the core positions of the EU is that as a result of Brexit, there should be no hard border on the island of Ireland. And that was something that was supported very strongly in a bipartisan manner here in the US. And we in Ireland are hugely grateful for that support that we received. I suppose another piece outside of the US there was international support beyond Britain, Ireland, and the US. Of course, I mentioned the European Union, but also Finland, Canada, South Africa, and others were very involved in the peace process, both through advice and the sharing of experts that helped the multi-party talks. One other piece before I go to the talks themselves were the importance of women in the agreement. In many of the histories, we talk about the great men that led to the arrival of peace in Northern Ireland, and often they overlook the role of women in the agreement. And I think it's important to note the importance of The Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, they were one of the parties in the multi-party talks. People like Breed Rogers, who was the first female chairperson of any political party in Ireland, be it North or South. Dr. Monica McWilliams, Dr. May Blood are names that some of you may know. They were critical to influencing the final agreement and to ensuring that it was as strong and comprehensive as it is. Then in terms of the talks themselves, excuse me, in in 1995, after the IRA, so the Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries announced ceasefires in 1994, George Mitchell became chairman of an international body that was set up to oversee decommissioning of paramilitary arms. Unfortunately, in February of 1996, the IRA ended its ceasefire and resumed violence, but multi-party talks began in 1996. So these were multi-party talks with the vast majority of parties in Northern Ireland, be they Catholic or Protestant, and they were chaired by Senator George Mitchell, and they involved the Irish and the British government. Sinn Féin was excluded until 1997. As I said, the IRA had ended their ceasefire, but they joined again later in 1997 when the IRA announced a ceasefire. And these talks continued for, I don't know the exact number of days, but it was in and around 700 days. And these talks resulted in the Good Friday Agreement on the 10th of April, 1998. So what is the agreement? The agreement is essentially, it's a peace agreement, it's a peace treaty. As I said, also known as the Belfast Agreement, it led to the establishment of a devolved power sharing government in Northern Ireland and the creation of a whole host of new institutions that oversaw what we call the totality of relationships. And the totality of relationships were the relationships within Northern Ireland between the two communities, Catholic and Protestant, North-South, so the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Assembly and the government in the Republic, and then East-West, and that's the relationship between Britain and Ireland. And I suppose the genius of the Good Friday Agreement is that it looked at those three really important relationships, important and interlocking relationships in their totality. So ultimately, the Good Friday Agreement is actually two agreements. It's two agreements, so it's both one which is called the British-Irish Agreement and another one which is called the Multi-Party Agreement. I won't go into too much detail, but just essentially to state that the British-Irish Agreement, I suppose, looked at, it's an international treaty between Britain and Ireland, and what it did is it recognises the legitimacy of a choice made by the people of Northern Ireland as to whether they continue to be part of the United Kingdom, the UK, or whether they become part of a united Ireland. And that, again, is the principle of self-determination. It recognises that this will only happen for the people, if the people of the whole island agree. So both there's a majority north of the border in Northern Ireland and a majority in the south for Northern Ireland to join the south. And then again, that's the principle of consent. It also recognised that while there was a substantial number of people within Northern Ireland who wished for a united Ireland, the majority of people in Northern Ireland at the time of the agreement wished to remain part of the United Kingdom. And then most importantly, it recognised that it was the right of people born in Northern Ireland to choose to identify as British or Irish or both. So there was that real recognition that this, Northern Ireland is a special place, and that people can have one or multiple identities. Excuse me. What I should say is that the Good Friday Agreement was approved by referendums in Northern Ireland and in the Republic in May of 1998, and it was overwhelmingly accepted. So it is most definitely a peace agreement that is by, of, and for the people. And now I'll talk a little bit about the three strands of the agreement. So I mentioned before that totality of relationships. So relationships within Northern Ireland between the two communities, relationships north and south, and relationships east and west. And each of these relationships is overseen by a different strand of the agreement. So there's strand one, often called the strand one institutions, and these are the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Executive, and that's essentially the devolved power sharing government of Northern Ireland. The second strand is what's called the North-South Ministerial Council. So this is how the devolved administration in Northern Ireland cooperates with the government in the Republic. And there were 6 agreed areas of cooperation, and these were agriculture, education, environment, health, tourism, and transport. And the idea would be that ministers would meet to discuss and coordinate policy to ensure a smooth functioning of those policy areas, often which don't often respect a border. Transport. There's roads that go from Dublin to Belfast, and there needs to be cooperation there. Healthcare. There's areas of expertise in London that there may not be in Belfast, so there needs to be in Dublin that there may not be in Belfast, so there needs to be a sharing of healthcare. So really that was to try and look at what was called the all Ireland economy and ensure that there was a functioning north and south, and that the border didn't limit cooperation. And then the third part looks at east-west, and this looks at a whole host of institutions that ensure greater coordination and collaboration between Britain and Ireland, and the islands as well. So there's the British Irish Council, there's the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, and they meet on a not necessarily an annual basis, but they meet as and when needed. So essentially, that's an overview of how the agreement worked. I suppose the one that people focus in on most is often the devolved administration. So self-government for the people of Northern Ireland. At the moment, that executive, they call it the executive, the assembly, the executive is not sitting, and we can speak about that a little bit later when I talk about some of the challenges. So next, I suppose, to look at the successes of the agreement. This slide should be a lot longer than it is, because the successes of the agreement, while the slide is short, the import of each of the words is heavy and weighty. I suppose successes of the agreement, the first is peace. And really this could be, we could just have one word for the success of the agreement. There is a whole generation of people in Northern Ireland who have not known conflict. So, a lot of people, 10 years younger than me, they read about the conflict, they hear about it from family members, but they really didn't experience it themselves. And that can't be understated, the importance of living in a place where there's peace, and where the differences are agreed through democratic and non-violent and peaceful means. Those of you who've been to Northern Ireland in the last period will know and will have seen that dividend of peace. Northern Ireland is a flourishing part of the world. It's very beautiful. There's a real cultural vibrancy, in particular, really, really strong cultural strength, both in the arts, there, and something that is, I suppose, a dividend of that peace. Another one is, there's no violence. So there have not been the scale or the level of violence that we saw during the Troubles. That just hasn't been there in the last 25 years. I suppose another piece is the Good Friday Agreement really has transformed relationships at every level, north-south, within Northern Ireland, and east-west. And I suppose, again, that commitment to peace is there amongst everybody. Nobody wants to go back to violence. While there is occasionally some violence, this is, the 0.00001% of people who want to pursue violence. It's just not there anymore. This piece has really helped to transform and to change the society in Northern Ireland. People are living longer, they're healthier. Life expectancy 25 years ago was about 79 for, life expectancy back then was about 76, it's now about 79, so it's increased quite a bit. There's a move away, which is quite interesting, from the old binaries of nationalist or unionist. Now there's a growing percentage of the population that don't identify as either nationalist or unionist. They see themselves as Northern Irish, and they could be Catholic, they could be Protestant, but they don't see themselves as nationalist or unionist. They see themselves as Northern Irish. In the last election held in 2022, about 13.5% of the population voted for a party that is called the Alliance Party. It's a party that seeks cross-community support and doesn't align itself to either nationalist or unionist. That's their largest showing. It's been growing in every election. And that's, I think, a real sign that people are, moving beyond just the simple binaries that defined the past. And as well, the population of Northern Ireland has grown. I think at the time of the signing of the agreement, there were about 20,000 people that were neither that weren't born in either Northern Ireland, Britain, or Ireland, and now that's about 130,000. So there's been quite a marked increase in folks choosing to live in Northern Ireland from elsewhere, and I think that's a real mark of a successful society. We're coming towards the latter slides, so I hope you have your questions ready. Having said all that, it's not to say that there haven't been challenges. So for the past 25 years, for about 40% of those 25 years, which was maybe 8 to 9 years, the devolved administration hasn't sat. It has been out of action because of disagreements amongst the parties. However, there has been sustained engagement from the Irish government, the British government, the US, the European Union, to get the institutions back up and running. And often what that has involved, often what that has involved is a successor agreement. So an agreement that focuses in, be it on flags and symbols, or it could be justice and policing, or it could be the particular operation of the Good Friday Agreement. But in each case, parties and governments have come back together to resolve these issues peacefully, which again, I think speaks to the importance and the commitment of the people of Northern Ireland and their political parties to peaceful solutions. One of the big challenges of recent years has been Brexit. I suppose Brexit in a place where uncertainty can cause difficulty, and Brexit caused a huge amount of uncertainty. You'll remember when I was speaking just about the importance of the European Union as a context within which peace was possible, to have Britain leave and Northern Ireland leave the European Union just caused issues and concerns, and I suppose issues and concerns around the border. So one of the great successes of the Good Friday Agreement was that it effectively, the border, that militarized border that I spoke about from my childhood was gone. Driving between the Republic and the North, the only way you'd cross the border or crossed into Northern Ireland was that your cell service might change to a different cell provider. And in the South, we use kilometers per hour, and the North use miles per hour. So the street signs would change a little bit, but there was no infrastructure. There was free movement across, and that was very, very important. And there was a concern that with Britain leaving essentially the European Union, which is a trade bloc, Britain and Northern Ireland leaving this trade bloc, that there would have to be some kind of border to police to a change in regulatory jurisdictions. Very, very long story short, with the support of the US and our European partners, Britain's exit from the European Union didn't result in a hard border. They had what was called, you'll have heard the term protocol. So the protocol was essentially an agreement as part of Britain's leaving of the European Union, which figured out how to ensure that there would be no hard border on the island of Ireland. However, that did cause some issues in the implementation of the protocol. The government of the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson, despite having agreed and negotiated the protocol, then went back and said, after it had been agreed, that they needed to change an international agreement, which caused issue and concern because it is something that had been agreed by the European Union and by Britain, not even several months before issues were raised by the British government. So essentially in the last number of years, there's been ongoing discussions and negotiations as to how we can make the protocol work. And I'm glad to say that I think it was at the end of February or very early March, the British government and the European Union agreed to what were called the Windsor frameworks. And the Windsor frameworks were essentially a series of agreements that will say how the protocol will operate. and how trade will happen between the United Kingdom and the EU, including Northern Ireland. We can go a little bit more into how that works and operates if people have questions, but I just don't want to go too far into it because it can get very, very confusing. Needless to say, there has been an agreement, and the hope is that that agreement will allow the Assembly, so the institutions, the executive, the devolved Parliament in Northern Ireland to get back up and running. There's been broad acceptance from the vast majority of political parties in Northern Ireland for that Windsor framework. There has been there's a significant majority of people within Northern Ireland that support moving forward and getting the Assembly back up and running. However, one of the parties has yet to make a decision on the Windsor framework and whether or not they will go back into the devolved Assembly. And the way it works in Northern Ireland is you need, I suppose, the two, you need parties from both sides, both Protestant and Catholic, to go forward for the Assembly to get back up and running. And it's our sincere hope that will happen in the coming months. I suppose the second challenge is around reconciliation. So while there is a cessation of violence and people want to move forward peacefully, it doesn't necessarily mean that these two communities have come together to form one community and put aside their differences. So in Northern Ireland, many of the communities still live apart. In certain areas, particularly around Belfast, communities are actually separated by what are called peace walls, which are huge, I don't even know how high, 30, 40 feet high walls that are built between the communities to stop them interacting in a conflictual manner. Many children are still educated in schools that are monodenominational, so there's no real integrated education, which many people see as extremely important to the future of Northern Ireland. At the moment, I think between 7 to 8% of students are integrated with children of another community or religious background, and that hasn't changed hugely over 25 years. And then there's other issues, I won't go into them here, but if people have questions, I'm happy to do it, around legacy and how the legacy of the Troubles will be managed and how the rights of victims and survivors will be supported. At the moment, the British government is pursuing a bill they're calling the Legacy Bill, which essentially would draw a solid line under everything that happened during the Troubles, which would mean that investigations and prosecutions of those that perpetrated crimes can't happen. This is something which is strongly opposed by the government here in the US, by the Irish government, by all political parties in Northern Ireland, and it takes an awful lot to get consensus of all political parties in Northern Ireland. Indeed, the upper house of the British Parliament, Select Committee on Northern Ireland in the House of Lords, thinks that this breaks international law. So there are definitely still some issues that we have yet to overcome. I probably shouldn't have ended on challenges, but I know there'll probably be some questions around those challenges. But really what I want to say, and this is my final slide, is we have a saying in Gaelic, in Irish, and it's an rudas anmh is iontuch, and it means what's rare is wonderful. And really, peace processes and peace agreements, such as the Good Friday Agreement at 25 years, is not something that there's an awful lot of in the world today. Peace agreements either fall down within the first number of years, or they just don't. They just don't work. But because of the commitment of the people of Northern Ireland to a peaceful future and to a peaceful democratic future, and the commitment of the British government, the Irish government, and the US, this peace agreement has held, and I suppose is the context through which the relationships within Northern Ireland and between Northern Ireland, Britain and Ireland, it's the context within which these operate. Again, I just wanted to underline the importance of that US support. You'll have seen from my presentation that US support was important from the very get-go, from the very start, and it remains of central importance today. The visit of President Biden 2 weeks ago was critical to show that, for the most powerful country, for the most powerful man in the world, what happens in Northern Ireland matters. There is still an interest in supporting Northern Ireland, in supporting the peace in Northern Ireland and the economic development of Northern Ireland. And I suppose just the final thing I'll finish on is that, yes, we have a peace agreement in Northern Ireland. Yes, we've had it for 25 years, but peace is a process, and we're still very much in that process. The Good Friday Agreement is, I suppose, our roadmap to an ever more peaceful and an ever more integrated society in Northern Ireland, but it takes consistent work and consistent support. It's something that I, as an Irishman, can say it has dramatically impacted my life. It's something I'm very proud to say that Ireland and Northern Ireland have managed to maintain over the last 25 years. And also, I just want to finish on a note of thanks because the support, particularly the support of Irish America to Ireland and to peace in Northern Ireland has been really central and really crucial. So thank you. I'll finish my presentation there. And Pierre, I look forward to our conversation, and then I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a masterful presentation. What you covered in 40 minutes was terrific. And in fact, I may actually just use this in my class. I spent a couple of days in my terrorism and public policy class looking at Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Troubles, and all of that. And you hit on a lot of really important points. And I'm sure there'll be some questions from the audience about that as well. So what we'll do is we'll just have a conversation for a few minutes and then pass it on to the audience with Ray with some questions. So I had just a couple questions related to this conflict, the Troubles, the Good Friday Agreement, and then maybe a couple things about Ireland that have nothing to do with the Troubles and the GFA. So this idea of the principles of consent, the idea that at some point in the future, the people of Northern Ireland and the people of the Republic could actually vote on whether there'll be a unification. I'd like to touch on that a little bit further. When I was growing up in Los Angeles, I saw bumper stickers that said 26 plus 6 equals 1. And that was a Republican phrase, the 26 counties plus the 6 counties of Ulster equals 1 country. And clearly, we talk about the peace walls, and I saw those last summer when I was in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Very striking, very powerful murals. I mean, there's a clear division, physical segregation. At the same time, you mentioned that there's an entire generation, I guess you call it a post-war generation, that has grown up in Northern Ireland where the Troubles are a memory. And so I'm wondering, do you see the possibility of, at some point down the line, of unification, especially given the issues of Brexit? I mean, I'm kind of wondering if Brexit might have this strange counterintuitive result in which people in Northern Ireland, and I'm wondering to what extent can you gauge this, including people on the PUL side, on the Protestant Union Loyalist side, and perhaps these new people who are calling themselves Northern Irish, where they may say it's worth it to actually reunify or unify with Ireland to be part of the European Union, as well as to get past these things. Do you see Brexit as possibly, ironically, leading down the line to the principles of consent being agreed to?
Yeah, Pierre, it's an excellent question, and I suppose just to say, Brexit definitely. I've seen more talk about a united Ireland since Brexit than I have before. Like an order of magnitude in difference of the amount of discussion, be it online or in person. I'm seeing sort of an order of magnitude of difference between before Brexit and post Brexit, and that is, I suppose, I can't say yes or no. I don't have that answer, but has discussion around the concept of a united Ireland increased since Brexit? Yes, dramatically. Is there a sense that Brexit pulled people away from an identity that they felt was very important to them? Yes, most definitely. If we look at the Brexit vote, a majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. They left akin to the Scots because the vast majority of English people within the United Kingdom voted to leave. But people in Northern Ireland, I'm not sure the exact percentage. I think it was in the high 50s or low 60s of people in Northern Ireland wanted to remain part the European Union. So that has definitely raised discussion around a united Ireland, because obviously if there is a reunification, Northern Ireland would become part of the Republic and would therefore be again a core constituent part of all of the international engagements and relationships that the Republic has. I suppose just to look at it in terms of just some stats, and again, stats can be manipulated in many different ways, but there's a really, really good series of, if people are interested, of research that's going on at the moment called ARENS, so which stands for Analysing Research in Ireland North and South. And it's a project that's been carried out by, I believe, Queen's University in Belfast, the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, and Notre Dame here in the States, and they're in Indiana. And they just recently did a poll around the preferences of people in Ireland North and South. So they looked at about 1,000 people north of the border and 1,000 people in the south, and they asked them around Irish unification. So if a vote on Irish unification were to take place today, how would you vote? So in terms of voters in Northern Ireland, an overwhelming majority voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. So an overwhelming majority, not just the Protestant community, but also the Catholic community. So if we look at numbers of those 1,000, only 27% in Northern Ireland said that they would want to reunify with the Republic, compared to 50% in favour of remaining in the UK, which I think people who have done the maths will see that 23% don't know is a very large percentage. But still, the numbers that are saying they definitely want to remain part of the UK are almost twice that for people that definitely want to reunify, which I think is very, very interesting.
Yeah,
if we look at Catholic voters in the north, so if you break that data down and look at Catholic voters, just 55%, so just over half of Catholic voters said they would want to reunify. 21% said they want to remain part of the UK, and then a very large percentage said don't know. But still, if a vote were held today, and if that were a vote that were held today, there would be no United Ireland. The 26.6 would not be forming one; they would be 26 and 6. But ultimately, I suppose the broader piece is that the principle of consent, and the important piece about the Good Friday Agreement, is the principle of consent says that at some time in the future, if the majority of people in the north and the majority of people in the south want a united Ireland, that's something that can happen, and that's something that can happen most importantly through the ballot box and not through military means. I might just jump back to that poll and give you the numbers for Ireland. So for the Republic, of the 1,000 people asked in the Republic, fully 2/3 said that they would want reunification. So there's no issue there in terms of people in the south not wanting Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic. That number seems to be fairly strong. I say take these statistics with a pinch of salt. I personally haven't seen any statistics that say that a majority of people in Northern Ireland would want to reunify. But if you change the question, you see those figures shift. I think one of the things that we can be very certain of with Brexit is that people in Northern Ireland are now very sensitive to the idea of a simple binary question, yes or no. They want to know, yes, but what are we saying yes to? So, if at any point there were to be, the principle of consent does result in the 26 counties and 6 counties becoming one united Ireland, there would be questions around what would that state look like? Would it be like Germany, where there is, one federal, there's a federation with one central parliament? Would there be a federation or a confederation here? Would there be one parliament? Would the Stormont Assembly still sit? So there's a lot of questions, and I think people now, as part of that broader discussion that Brexit threw up, people are kind of saying, there aren't simple answers to complex questions. There are complex answers to complex questions, and before I'm asked a complex question, I want to think about the complex answer. So to add, I suppose that was a very, very long way to answer your question. So the principle of consent allowed it in a peaceful way, which I think is the most important part of the Good Friday Agreement. But as to what people would vote, I can't say. I don't know.
Okay. So yeah, I would say that on my travels, one of the things that struck me was how easy it was to cross. It's literally like crossing between East and West Berlin. You literally, there's like a marker and that's it. And you blink and you've crossed the border. Basically, it's a question of changing currency. And as you said, miles per hour versus kilometers. And I think as long as you have that ease of going back and forth, I don't imagine that you would have a lot of people saying we want to unify. But if Brexit, if the deal doesn't go through, if it becomes a harder border, maybe that might change some people's minds. You don't, and you can sort of have your cake and eat it too right now. You can be Northern Irish. You can go back and forth. All these kinds of things. I think it's pretty interesting. The other, I'd like to maybe keeping an eye on the time. I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. Kevin, are you there? It looks like you might have frozen. He's reconnecting. He just texted me. The internet, his internet went down. So let's give it a minute until he comes back.
Okay, Pierre, I'll just let you know I do have several questions from the audience.
Okay. Oh, he can hear me. Okay. All right. So he can hear me. I guess he's just waiting. Okay. So let me ask the question then. So while he can hear me, and when he comes back on, he can address it. What I'd like to do, again, keeping an eye on the time. I had a couple questions for you, really, that have nothing to do with Northern Ireland. You are the Consul General for the Republic of Ireland and represent the country. And I had a question about Irish policy regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ireland is a member of the EU, but it is not a member of NATO. It is a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace, and which reflects Ireland's longstanding position of neutrality or not getting involved in wars since it became a republic. And I'm just wondering, what is Ireland's position on Ukraine? And do you see at any point in the future, is there discussion in Ireland about the possibility of joining NATO, the way Finland has and the way Sweden wants to, both two countries giving up their neutrality? Obviously, they're on the front line, but I'm just wondering what is Ireland's relationship with all of this? And let me see. Unfortunately, yeah, he looks like he's still not. It looks like we still lost him. Oops, he just popped out, so maybe he's going to pop back in again. Let's give it a minute and see what happens.
Well, he will, but I think he probably had to get off of his.
Yeah. I see he's off, so he's gonna come back on.
Yeah, but that was probably essential that happened.
That's the downside.
Make sure
Technology is wonderful until it stops working.
So I have a question for you, Pierre.
Yes.
Just recently we're in Ireland. Did you notice any difference between the sort of economic stature of people, standard of living and so forth between the North and the South?
I have to say, is he back? He's coming back on.
I'm back. If you can hear or see me, I'm not sure.
Yes, very good.
Sorry, Pierre, I could hear your question, your excellent question on Russia, Ukraine, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about that. So I suppose just a few points to make. I suppose first of all, yes, Ireland is militarily neutral, but we're not politically neutral. So I suppose on issues of liberty and tyranny, we always side on the side of liberty. So yes, we are militarily neutral. So we're not involved in the conflict in a military way, but we are very, very much involved in supporting Ukraine in non-military ways. So Ireland is giving about 170 million. So just in terms of scale, Ireland is 5 million people, the US is 330 million people. So we're giving about 170 million in non-military, non-lethal aid. So that's, protective equipment, helmets, flak jackets, medical equipment, medical supplies. We're also at the moment giving shelter to about 78,000 Ukrainian, mostly women and children. So they've been welcomed in since day one. They are now, some of them are working in our hospitals, in our schools, but, their kids are going to school in Ireland. They're being provided with houses and financial support as they go through this. Again, just to give it context, to scale that up, if Ireland were the size of the US, that'd be the equivalent of giving shelter to about 5 million people over the last year or so. So it's really quite a very large number of people that we're welcoming in. And then Ireland as well is very, very heavily involved in both European and US efforts to try and bring the conflict to an end, and to an end that fully respects the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. And then I suppose just another piece that's important to note is Ireland is one of the leaders in the European Union on the extension of European Union membership to the Ukraine. We think, we fully see Ukraine as part of the broader European family. Yes, there are definitely conditions that need to be met from European membership, or we're not saying that it should be given tomorrow, but Ireland is very, very strongly supportive of assisting and supporting Ukraine to join the European Union. So when Ukraine put forward their application for EU membership, Ireland was one of the member states that was very strongly supportive of full consideration of that. So just to underline, yes, we're militarily neutral, but not politically neutral. To that broader question of whether, like Finland and others, whether we would consider joining NATO, I suppose Ireland's neutrality has a long historical context. It's something that's definitely very it's a piece of Ireland's foreign policy that's very known and cherished and held dear. I think one of the things that's important to note that yes, we are neutral, but it doesn't mean that we don't involve ourselves on the international stage. So Ireland has the longest unbroken service of any UN member state of having troops in the field wearing either blue berets or blue helmet over 60 years. No one else has that. So, every day for the last 60 years, there's been an Irishman or an Irishwoman in the field defending human rights under a UN mandate. Is it being considered? There is a broader forum that's being considered to talk about not just neutrality, but kind of, I suppose, broader security policy and how that links to our foreign policy. So there are discussions that will be ongoing throughout the country in Ireland over the coming months. I'm not going to say what the outcome of those discussions will be. Again, it's a consultative process for communities and government. But is there a broader conversation? Yes, it is happening, but there's no end point that we're working towards. It's very much looking at how that sits in our broader foreign policy.
That's a great answer. I love the politically not neutral, militarily neutral. When I was there, one of the things that I've been to a lot of countries around the world, and it really struck me, and I actually mentioned this to my wife when we were there, that it really felt like the Republic was a country at peace. Walking around, it didn't feel like a country that was part of any military operation. It didn't feel like there was a security concern. It really struck me. And I remember having a conversation with someone who was actually working at a pub I believe in Dublin. And we were talking, and he was talking about how he just got out of the army. And I said, "Oh, the Irish Army." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "What did he do?" And he started listing off all of the peacekeeping missions that he had served in with the UN. And fascinating, as opposed to, he deployed, but he deployed on peacekeeping missions, and that's what the Irish Army does. And I just thought that was very striking as an American to hear that. One more question for you, and then we'll pass it on to the audience. So the Republic of Ireland is overwhelmingly Catholic. And I'm wondering if you could talk just briefly on what is the status of abortion and same-sex marriage in the Republic of Ireland?
Yeah, Pierre, as you mentioned, I'm not sure of the latest statistics, but yes, Ireland is, I don't want to say, I don't know, but like 95% Catholic. Although the stats on the latest census might be slightly different, but Ireland is broadly a country from a Catholic tradition. Ireland now has had two referenda in the last number of years, 2015 and 2018, where the people of Ireland changed their constitution to confer new rights on our citizens. 2015, Ireland became the first country in the world to vote for to allow marriage between people irrespective of sex, so essentially same-sex marriage. And then in 2018, we voted to repeal the Eighth Amendment in our Constitution. And the Eighth Amendment in our Constitution had been there since, I want to say, 1983. And it was a total ban on abortion, even in instances where the life of the mother was in danger. Because of either the pregnancy or an unviable pregnancy. That was later changed through another referendum, but in 2018, Ireland repealed that and introduced a woman's right to choose up to 15 weeks. So there has been, and people that, I suppose around that time I was posted in the US both times. I was on the West Coast in California for the same-sex marriage vote, and then I was here, or had just moved here, just after the repeal the eighth, so the women's right to choose referendum. And I suppose in many instances it kind of jarred with that image of Ireland as a heavily Catholic country, and a country where I suppose Catholic teaching influenced social policy. And yes, it did for much of the first 70 years, 80 years of Irish, 60 years, 60, 70 years of Irish independence. Yes, Catholic social teaching did strongly influence social policy within Ireland. But there has been quite a big change. There's a wonderful book of people, I'm not going to be able to explain it in 2 minutes, but there's a wonderful book that I'd strongly encourage folks to read if they're interested in that broader change within Ireland. It's by a columnist in the Irish Times called Fintan O'Toole, who in my mind is kind of a modern day George Bernard Shaw. I think he's one of the cleverest public intellectuals that we have, both in Ireland and also Britain. He writes quite a lot on Brexit, and he has a book called We Don't Know Ourselves, and it looks at the changes, both economic, political, cultural, in Ireland over the course of his lifetime. So from the mid 1950s to the present day.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. That's terrific. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I'm looking forward to keeping in touch with you as well. I'm going to pass it on to Ray, so you'll have an opportunity to take some questions from the audience. Ray?
Perfect.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you, Kevin. We have several questions. First one is from Michael Murphy. Good Irish name.
Thank you. Consul General, thank you for your presentation, by the way, and I'm glad you're here in America. It seems to me that most Americans, particularly Americans of Irish descent, tend to romanticize the Troubles based on books they've read or movies they've seen. Frankly, there's a lot of ignorance about the Troubles and what they really meant. Part of my family, believe it or not, still has a grudge against Cromwell, so it goes it can go way back. But you talked about books earlier. One book that I think was read a lot, it has been read a lot in the past few years, was called Say Nothing by Patrick Keefe. I think it came out about 2018. And I walked away from reading it feeling great sadness for how that all came about and continued for so long, and how senseless it seemed to me that the violence was, and it probably really accomplished very little. Is that book accurate? I mean, first of all, if you've read it, I don't expect you to opine on if you haven't read it, but is that generally considered an accurate portrayal of the Troubles? And the question I have is IRA still exist in any form, or is it all melted into the Sinn Féin?
Good question. I'll touch on the pieces I can. I haven't read the book. My apologies. I've noted it down. I'm always looking to read books about Ireland that the folks recommend. I can only guess that it shows quite a brutal and difficult portrayal of what life was like under in the Troubles. I suppose I can only bring it back to my own experience. I used to do a lot of when I was younger, folks in the border regions, we used to do a lot of kind of cross-border community projects as a kid. So, you'd go and you'd meet kids from, a Protestant community, and you'd, talk about what you had in common and what was different. If any of you have ever seen the Netflix TV show Derry Girls, it's actually a very accurate portrayal of both, the heartbreak and the happiness of being a young person, but particularly a young person in a time of conflict. it was a horrible time. You know, obviously many people know the Omagh bombing, which was one of the worst atrocities of the Troubles. Like, you turn on your TV and you'd be enjoying, you know, whatever you were doing, like Sunday lunch, and then you turn on and see that there was a bomb that killed, you know, a woman shopping with her young kids, and a pregnant mother, you know, exchange students visiting Ireland, and they were all given very little warning. So like, yes, I suppose there has been a romanticization of this broader sort of striving for freedom, but 50,000 people being injured, and they carry those injuries with them today. You know, 36,000 people being killed. It was a very, very heavy toll. So, and you know, as you see from the Good Friday Agreement, there was, you know, broad and very large acceptance of that peace process. So, you know, the people of Northern Ireland wanted peace, and they were living in a society that was torn and ravaged by conflict. To your question around, and I suppose the strong, very, very strong levels of support for people for a continuation of a peaceful society in Northern Ireland really shows how the people of Northern Ireland look back on that very difficult time. As to whether the IRA still exists, there are pockets of paramilitary activity both on the Republican and the Loyalist side. I don't know how, you know, I don't know the exact figures, but they don't represent a large portion of the community. They're really very much renegades, kind of doing solo runs. But again, you know, if you have somebody in a small society that is willing to, you know, pick up a gun that's concerned, or, you know, plant a bomb that's concerned for the whole society. But the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland do not want that. They want, you know, peaceful, political, democratic means. And as well, I think one of the points it's important to note is, you know, the people of Northern Ireland want what everybody else wants. They want good schools. They want, you know, safe streets. They want somebody to deal with the cost of living crisis. They want, you know, good healthcare. They want homes that are affordable. And at the moment, the Assembly, so the devolved Parliament in Northern Ireland, is not sitting. So they don't have their local politicians that they elected to help resolve some of those issues. What they have are civil servants, you know, public sector workers that are managing those, and aren't making policy. They're just implementing policy already in place. So sorry, I've totally veered off the point, but I will definitely check out that book, and I hope I at least touched on some aspects of your question, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Audrey Weinbinger. Audrey, out there? Audrey?
Well, I was just wondering about when you spoke about the plantations and the nobles' sons coming over. Was it because land was running out and they needed more land, or was it kind of a colonialization mentality of?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it was an element of both. There was this sense that, you know, nobles in the UK had, you know, more than one son. When you passed on land and title, you passed it on to one son. So there were kind of other sons that needed to go places. Some of them joined trades. Sorry, not trades. Some of them traded and traveled internationally. Some of them joined the clergy, and then others, I suppose, you know, moved and effectively took up land elsewhere. But it's a fascinating period of history, and well worth a read if you're interested in that and learning more.
Lisa Marshall asked me to ask this question, but this is her question, and it's more information about Brexit. And I guess to kind of expand on this a little bit, is having a kind of a more fluid border between the North and the South likely to lead to criminal activity where people are trying to smuggle goods across the border without these kind of controls? You know, is there, you know, this seems to me at least to be creating a problem that doesn't exist, and you know, the borders between, say, France and England are much, you know, so how is this going to get managed, and is this a kicking the problem down the road? Kind of
No, Lisa, that's a very good question. It's a question that has been involved in, I suppose, negotiations on how you square the circle of Britain and Northern Ireland leaving the European Union, while Northern Ireland and the Republic share share an island. So on one island, we have, I suppose, two regulatory systems. Ultimately, the decision that was arrived at to I suppose avoid this situation was that Northern Ireland is in a very unique position. So Northern Ireland is in both the EU single market for goods, which means that goods can flow freely between the Republic and the North, and it's also in the UK internal market. It's the only place in the world that is in both the UK internal market and the EU single market. And essentially issues around the protocol and now the Windsor framework, they're put in place, and all of the, I won't go into the detail of them, but there's a whole series of proposals and systems which will ensure that there isn't, I suppose, leakage of goods into either the European single market or the UK internal market, and that's done through tracking of goods, reporting on what's happening, what's included in convoys that are moving between Britain and Northern Ireland and vice versa. So there are mechanisms in place. They're quite technical, and both the EU and UK are working to ensure that that doesn't happen. That smuggling doesn't happen.
All right, very good. Okay, actually, we have time for one more question, and I think Betty Townsend actually had a question, so we'll turn to her, and she'll probably say goodnight as well. So go ahead, Betty.
I believe you had mentioned, and I had heard this from a commentator a couple of weeks ago, that the school children in Northern Ireland, that you believe, I think you said 7 or 8%, this person said not more than 10% of the children going to school together are actually integrated in terms of the different faith groups. Is that what you had said?
Yeah, so yes, I think it's 7 to 8% of school children in Northern Ireland are integrated in non-denominational schools. What I would say though is when people get to university level, there is greater mixing, and university numbers, those in full-time education, third level education, have increased dramatically since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So they've increased by about, I don't know the exact number, but by about 50%. So there is mixing, but it's just there isn't mixing at that younger age, which many people see as kind of being important, because at that younger age, that's when you dispel any of those preconceptions that are maybe developed at a young age.
Yeah, and that was exactly the point I wanted to make. I've also been to Ireland and experienced that wonderful driving back and forth. And the only other thing I noticed also is that there might be, I think that the shoulders may have been missing in Northern Ireland versus the Republic, where there seem to be wider. You might have a greater chance of riding your bicycle and actually survive riding road than in Northern Ireland. But without the mixture of the early children, I agree that was going to be the point of my question. If they're not mixing at that young age, is that a positive problem? But if they go on to higher ed, there is. And do the majority of the students go on to higher ed in Ireland? And in both Northern and the Republic?
In Northern Ireland, I'm not sure of the statistics, but I suppose one of the things that's really, really positive is the emergence in Northern Ireland of that group that see themselves, that other. So you're either, unionist or nationalist, and now that growth of the other, who are people that say, I'm Northern Irish, I want to live here, I want things to work, I don't care what religion somebody is. Not that I don't care, but it doesn't bother me what religion somebody is. That's not core to my identity or to how I engage with them, and I think that growth shows that that's very positive. That shows that people are mixing and are moving beyond the old binaries. Just on Ireland, one of the things I'm quite proud of is Ireland is the most educated country in Europe. I'm not sure the exact stats, but I think it's 60-something% of people between the ages of 25 and 65, or 24 and 65 have third level education, which makes us the most educated country in Europe. So I don't know if that means that all of us go to university, but definitely a large majority of us do, and it's free, which helps people go.
My mother's ancestry is from Ireland, and when I went there, it was just to have a trip. When I arrived, my DNA woke up, and I swear to God, I think I had died and gone to heaven. He could have just simply buried me in the ancestral graveyard. because the thing that I loved was that the Irish loved to talk. You could be at a bus stop, you could sit on a bench, you could just be, and the Irish would just come up and start talking to you, and I loved it. And one of the things I heard many Irish say is that how much they love their, I was just in the Republic, and I had crossed over to Northern Ireland just in traveling en route, but they love their school system. And as you know, here in the United States, we struggle with the public schools and the private schools and the vouchers, and where do you get your education? And except for maybe the field trips were better, perhaps with the private schools, people would love their public education. And I thought, wow, how wonderful that you're in agreement with that. It was just great. Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Kevin, you probably realize that half of America thinks they're Irish, in particular on St. Patrick's Day, and
I'm happy to claim them.
You what? You what?
We're happy to claim them. We're very happy they think themselves as Irish. So do we.
If everybody who claims to be Irish went back to the island, it would sink into the ocean, the Irish Sea. I do have one funny question for you. If you did not see Dairy Girls on Netflix, you ought to watch it. You don't have to have Irish ancestry to appreciate it. But I have one question. Having grown up in Catholic schools, and a bit maybe earlier era, I don't recall that we Catholic girls or Catholic kids in general, our language was quite that salty. And I thought, no, that can't be. I mean, people get the impression that Irish schoolgirls just really worse than sailors. Now, was that part of the document or the filming? Would you say that's accurate? I mean, is Irish?
I went to an all boys school. Not an all. It's set, Dairy Girls is set in an all girls school. I went to an all boys school, and not my language, but some of my peers' language was salty.
That's salty.
So,
whoa.
Yeah.
Well, okay, maybe been a different area. I think the nuns would have absolutely. Whew, my goodness, I hate to.
Oh no, yeah, just outside of classes. No, in class everybody's very friendly, very polite and proper.
If we had been overheard. Yes. Well, thank you. This was wonderful, wonderful. And I may ask for your email contact from Pierre. I may have an opportunity also to want to ask you just for your involvement in some other presentations. This was absolutely fantastic. Lovely evening with you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I know that you enjoyed it as much. I wish we had more time for your questions. We seem to have that problem with each of our programs. We always run out of time. And this is where, again, I love the Zoom because our audience can come from anywhere. But Kevin, if we were doing this in person, people would be hovered around your podium and be walking you to your car and say, well, let's just go get a beer. And we can carry on there. And unfortunately, that's the downside of being Zoom. I didn't ask my usual question of where's our furthest audience member coming from this evening. We do have people who come from all over. And I was going to ask if maybe some people were from Ireland, because we've had speakers from around the world who actually have brought some people with them, including Saudi Arabia and in Europe. It's been really quite exciting. But thank you all. I want to remind you again, please join us. This is our last program for distinguished speakers. We'll pick up again in the fall. We have an exciting summer ahead of us with the board. We may be making just a few program changes in terms of, we have listened to you, comment that perhaps we're a bit program overload because the series that runs between January and April is a bit frenetic. And we may even do a name change because we think all of our speakers are distinguished and wonderful. And the audience questions are always just fabulous. But join us again, May the 9th. You have to register, as you know. War sanctions, are they effective? And let me, of course, talk about Ukraine. I don't know that Putin responds to anything but what he wants to do in his head, but where have we seen sanctions work and not work in other places? That will be our last program of the year, so you will not want to miss it. And with that, I want to say good night. And we will slowly let you leave the room. We won't just switch the light off immediately, but thank you all. And thank you once again, Kevin. It has been delightful.